We have 4 excellent speakers today on this, and before I introduce them briefly, can I just remind everybody, if you haven't already, to just please mute your microphones. And I'll just remind you as well, because I can only do a brief introduction, the full speaker biographies and abstracts are available on the conference page online if you want to go and look at those afterwards. So our first speaker for this session is Eileen Kennedy. Eileen is the library digital experience developer at InUI Galway, and she manages the library's makerspace and online presence. Our second speaker in the session is Helen Fallon, who is Deputy University Librarian here at Maynooth University. Helen has published extensively and presented academic writing workshops both nationally and internationally, and she's also a member of the editorial board of the New Review of Academic Librarianship. Our third speaker is Joan Ward, who is Deputy Head of Libraries Development at the Local Government Management Agency. Libraries Development works with local authority library services and government departments in the development of public library services and the implementation of national strategy. Our fourth speaker today is Dr. Sandra Collins, the Director of the National Library. Sandra is originally a mathematician and has worked in digital innovation and cultural heritage over 20 years in the public and private sectors, and she's a member of numerous boards and committees. Before I hand over to Eileen to start our session, I'd like to invite attendees to add any question to the chat area, and all questions will be addressed in the session 3 virtual panel with all speakers. So thanks very much. I'm really excited to hear further on the case studies that will be presented in this session. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Eileen, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Fiona. Hi, everybody. And let me just get my screen shared here. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this now. Okay, so I'm really happy to hear that 3D printing has already been mentioned a couple of times today. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in more detail. So I always like to kick off with just talking about what actually is a makerspace. It's this kind of weird, quirky little corner that started popping up in libraries lately, but essentially it's a creative space where students of all disciplines can get hands-on experience with new technologies. So in our case, within the NUI Galway Library, that includes 3D printers, we have a drone, we have a virtual reality headset, so students can just try out new technology that they wouldn't normally have access to as part of their coursework. And the way we operate is that students can come in and use the space. There's no need to book it. They can use it for personal projects or coursework. We run workshops that they can take part in, and then they can also rent equipment, volunteer to help maintain the 3D printers and manage the print queue. And it's all free to staff and students of NUI Galway, which obviously is the library ethos and is something that we're very proud of. So I suppose I have to go through the timeline. Of course, we're all very familiar with this 12th March, 13th March date where we shut things down. So on the 12th of March, the makerspace was actually fairly buzzing. It was kind of, as it normally would be, groups of students working on video projects, collaborating together, working their way through the 3D print queue. And when we were told to close, we really hoped that we would be back in there in a couple of weeks. There had already been some talk amongst colleagues and amongst the makerspace community about the potential to 3D print personal protective equipment. So that was something that we were looking forward to getting started on with some of the students. But of course, it became evident that we weren't going to be able to get back in there at all. So on the 20th of March, when access to campus became further restricted, I was given permission to evacuate the 3D printers basically, and the makerspace moved in with me. So the NUI Galway makerspace kind of became the Mayo makerspace. And as of the 21st of March, it was a little bit more organized, looked a little bit more like a proper creative space, which was a good thing because on the 23rd of March was when the first request for 3D printed PPE actually came into me in the makerspace. So just to talk a little bit about what's being produced, the first thing I want to emphasize is that as makerspace manager, I would organize volunteers, I train up the students, I do lots of repairs on 3D printers. but I'm definitely not an engineer. I'm not from a clinical background, so I wouldn't have that expertise that's necessary to design any of this kind of equipment. And I honestly don't think that any makerspace library manager necessarily would or should. And the reason for that is that there's a huge online community of people who create this stuff, work together, collaborate, and really come up with these amazing designs. And then once you have access to a printer, you can create it yourself. So the first thing that was printed, which is exactly what's been mentioned already by colleagues, is these face shields. So they're made from a 3D printed headband. This was initially designed by a company called Prusa. They worked with the Czech Ministry of Health to design this, so it's very high specification. And so it's just the 3D printed headband, the elastic cord, and then in our case, we used an A4 acetate sheet, the same thing that you would use in one of those overhead projectors that you don't really see too much anymore. But the nice thing is that a lot of people still have those A4 sheets lying around, so they worked really nicely in this. And that's designed to be worn over an N95 mask to prolong its use. So obviously in an ideal situation, you would only be wearing your N95 mask once. These shields would be thrown out after one use, but as we know all too well, we're not in an ideal situation. So these come in really handy to just protect doctors, healthcare professionals, any frontline workers really, just that little bit more. So initially it was requested by a doctor in University Hospital Galway and also by the Brothers of Charity in Galway City. Fortunately, to the best of my knowledge, they haven't actually needed to use them yet, which is because of two reasons. One, there wasn't quite as much of a PPE shortage and crisis as we thought there would be in Ireland, and also just because things, I suppose, haven't gotten as bad as we expected in general in Ireland. That said, there's no harm in having this equipment just as a stopgap in case it is ultimately needed. The second thing that I've been producing here are these Subea snorkel adapters. So you might have seen these. Basically, it's a full face snorkel. So that's made by a company called Subea and just designed for, recreational swimming, snorkeling. But these little yellow, as you can see in the picture, 3D printed parts take about 3 hours to print. They just clip into the top and they enable you to use that snorkel as an emergency ventilator. Where they're actually being used currently is by surgeons or doctors who need to get a little bit closer to healthcare professional or to patients, but they need to have extra protection than would be afforded to them by those masks. So that's been put to use in the eye clinic in University Hospital Galway and also in Letterkenny University Hospital. And there's been really good feedback from those. So I actually put them in touch with a dentist in Galway who has access to a huge number of 3D printers that he wasn't able to use while his practice is closed. So the production has actually been able to be scaled up quite significantly with regards to those. Next, we have these mask ear savers. They're really, really simple. Just a 3D printed clip, takes 10 minutes, and it goes behind your head. You put the loops on your mask over it, and it just takes the pressure off your ears. So that's really helpful for frontline workers who have to wear masks all the time. I think about 300 of them have been distributed around the country at this point. So that's something that's been really useful. And I just want to talk about the process of what it's like to actually create these 3D prints. So as I said, not an engineer. So you can find these files online from any number of different networks. There are lots of forums where people discuss 3D prints, where they modify these designs and work together on them. One website that I use quite frequently is called Thingiverse. There are quite a lot of models on there and it's free to use. So you download your files, then print them. So load the file up into a slicing program in your computer, determine how fine it's going to be, that kind of thing, how fast it's going to print. And one really important thing is to act as if you are infected when you're producing this PPE. So that means wash your hands for 20 seconds, obviously, wear gloves and a mask when handling the 3D printed parts, and seal the items in a Ziploc bag and label with the date. So the reason for that is that after 3 days, any virus on the parts will be inactive, and then they're safe to be worn or used. And the final step is to post or deliver them. So it's actually a really straightforward supply chain. It can be done by one person with one printer. And just in terms of the NUI Galway Makerspace efforts, what really made a difference? Well, number one was promotion. I think a lot of people saw the library tweet about the 3D printed PPE with my selfie, which was slightly embarrassing, but that got great traction, and it led to a Teaching Cahir feature in which I did not speak Irish, tá brón orm, and then that led to further PPE requests, but actually more importantly, it led to additional participation. So beyond the further PPE requests, there were so many offers of help of people wanting to get involved from library colleagues, both academic and public libraries, and also just from individuals who had access to 3D printers who wanted to know what they could do. Another thing was investment. So going back years, the library saw a value in offering 3D printing as a service to students and staff and invested in these top-of-the-line printers. But of course, we never could have known that they would eventually be put to use to create PPE for a pandemic. I don't think that's anything that was ever predicted in the makerspace. And I think I always say the word community when I talk about makerspaces in general. The community is really what makes a makerspace. And of course, when we're separated, it is a little bit more difficult to get that community feeling. I mean, I don't have access to the makerspace students or library staff or anything like that at the moment, but that online community is still present and still very, very strong. So, you know, my colleagues have been hugely supportive in terms of what I've been doing. It's wonderful to hear from other libraries about what they're doing in this aspect. The online maker community, not just in terms of what they've developed for PPE, but in terms of the assistance I've gotten from people on forums when the printers have broken. So my first couple of pictures here are just from some fun work that I got to do, learning how to fix new issues with the printers. And it happens, you know, these printers are kind of made to be able to be repaired as necessary. Another thing that happened was that RS, one of our suppliers, donated €500 worth of PLA, which is the plastic that we use in the printers. They donated that to the makerspace earlier in the semester, but unfortunately everything closed before we were able to get going, so they actually delivered that to my house so I could continue the work on this, and that really was extremely helpful and just made a huge difference. So looking at the impact of what's happened, well, it definitely shows the value of makerspaces, for one thing, if there was ever a question of the need for them. And I think that 3D printing is the most visible activity that happens in a makerspace. It has a physical output, but there's also innovating, hacking, creating. All of those things happen in a makerspace. And that's exactly the type of thinking that students are going to need to be able to do to innovate through something like the COVID-19 pandemic or any other crisis that may hit down the line. And then the last thing that I want to stress is the value of the makerspace actually being in the library. So we can imagine if the makerspace was maybe based in engineering and if it was specifically for engineering students, obviously no ill will towards engineering students at all. We have a lot of engineering students who volunteer in the makerspace and they're wonderful. But I think it would maybe make people a little bit more hesitant to get in touch if they don't have a lot of experience, if they don't know exactly what they're asking for, if they don't know exactly how they can help. That fact that the library is an open place, in the case of NUI Galway, it's located in the literal and figurative heart of the campus. And that makes it so approachable and just reinforces that anyone from any discipline can contribute and help to make a difference. So thank you guys so much.